Welcome back to the deep dive. We are doing something a little different today. Usually we take a specific event or a really niche topic and just, drill down. But today we are zooming out, way out. We're looking at a word that has become a bit of a linguistic trap. You see it in headlines, you hear it in political debates, and I'm sure you've used it at dinner parties. I know I have.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those words.
That-
It's the kind of word that everyone just sort of nods along to, assuming we all mean the same thing by it.
Exactly. And that word is globalization.
Mm.
But the source material we're working with today, a really dense, comprehensive sociological chapter titled Globalization and Related Processors, it argues that when we say globalization, we are actually using a lazy shorthand. We're taking a massive, messy web of history and power dynamics and just flattening it into a single buzzword.
It's a great way of putting it. It's like describing a hurricane, a tsunami, and a thunderstorm simply as weather. I mean, it's technically true, but it misses all the mechanics of what is actually happening.
Right. And if you don't understand the mechanics, you don't really understand the world. So the mission today isn't just to define globalization in the economic sense of shipping containers and fiber optics. We are going to unpack the family tree of this concept. We're going to look at the isms that paved the way for the modern world, imperialism and colonialism, and then the cultural forces that are, well, still fighting for dominance right now.
And we're essentially drawing a map of power. The source frames this whole thing as a study of continuity. We tend to think of history as these neat little chapters. Chapter 1, empire. Chapter 2, nation states. Chapter 3, globalization. But the argument here is that these aren't separate chapters at all. They are layers.
Layers, yeah. The text uses a metaphor that I actually found quite helpful. It calls these concepts a stew or a soup. And the point is you can't just pick out the imperialism chunk and say it's gone. It is dissolved into the broth. It flavors everything we do today.
That's the key insight, really. You cannot understand a modern trade agreement or a multinational corporation without pasting that residue of imperialism. It's all still there, just simmering under new names and new management.
Okay, so let's grab a spoon and start with the base of the soup, the old guard. Imperialism. Now, I want to be careful here because imperialism is a word that gets thrown around as an insult, pre-casually, right? That's imperialist. But in the academic sense, what are we actually talking about?
Well, if we go right back to the etymology, it clarifies things immensely. It comes from the Roman Imperium. Now, most people hear that and they think of maps, Rome conquering Gaul, coloring the map red. But Imperium wasn't primarily about land. It was about authority.
Authority in what sense? Like military authority?
Military, yes, but also political and legal. It was the total right to command. The imperator, the emperor, held the legal right to command the military and the state. It implies a profound vertical power structure. One entity is up here commanding, and the other is down there obeying. That's the core of it.
So initially, it's about political domination, pure and simple. But the source points out that by the late 19th century, the definition shifted. It wasn't just about ruling, it became about competition.
Yes, this is absolutely crucial. This is the era of the scramble for Africa. This is where the definition gets messy. You had Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, all racing to claim chunks of the undeveloped world.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, I want to rule this place. It was, I need to rule this place before they do. It's a competitive sport, almost.
And this is where the morality enters the conversation, right?
Yeah.
The text mentions the Boer War as a kind of turning point for the term itself.
It absolutely was. The Boer War was a brutal conflict in South Africa, and it was one of the first times where the British public started looking at their own actions and asking, wait, are we the bad guys? Suddenly the term imperialism started to curdle. It went from a descriptor of glory to a critique of morality. It raised the question, does a civilized nation really have the right to subjugate a so-called backward one?
Which, of course, relies entirely on the assumption that you are the civilized one and they are the backward one.
Precisely. That is the bedrock of the entire imperial mindset. But we can't just look at this as a political game or a moral failing.
Yeah.
We have to look at the money. You cannot discuss imperialism without discussing Vladimir Lenin.
I have to say, I found this section fascinating because I usually associate Lenin with the Russian Revolution and the Soviet state, not necessarily as an economic theorist of capitalism.
He was a very, very sharp critic of how capitalism functions on a global scale. His book, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, it lays out a mechanism that is, well, you could argue it's still relevant today. His argument was that capitalism is a system that naturally produces a surplus.
A surplus of goods, like too many cars, too many toasters.
Not just goods, a surplus of capital. Think about it. You have a factory. You make profit. You reinvest that profit to make the factory bigger. You make more profit. Eventually, you run out of things to invest in within your own country. You have saturated the market. The engine is just running too hot.
So you have all this money, this capital, and nowhere to put it where it will grow.
Exactly. And for a capitalist, money that isn't growing is dying. So, Lenin argued, the capitalist nations had to expand. They didn't invade Africa or Asia just for the glory of the flag or out of some sense of moral duty. They invaded because they needed new markets to sell their surplus goods to, and even more importantly, new places to invest their surplus capital.
So, in Lenin's view, imperialism is just a safety valve for capitalism. If you close the valve, the domestic economy explodes. It can't handle the pressure.
He called it parasitic. He really did. He believed it was a sign that capitalism was rotting, that it couldn't survive on its own. It had to feed on other weaker economies to stay alive.
But there is a massive irony here that the source points out, which we have to address. The Soviet Union, the state founded on Lenin's principles, ended up acting pretty imperialist itself.
That is the great contradiction, isn't it? The Soviet Union was anti-capitalist, so theoretically it shouldn't have needed to be imperialist. It didn't have that surplus capital problem. And yet, look at Eastern Europe after World War II. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, they were, for all intents and purposes, colonies of Moscow.
So this suggests that imperialism isn't just about economics, it's about power, a raw desire for control.
It suggests that the drive to dominate might be deeper than just the profit motive, yes. But let's fast forward to today. We don't really have empires in that 19th century sense. We don't have the British viceroy sitting in India. So how do sociologists explain the power dynamics now?
This is great. The source contrasts two big theories here. On one side, you have these thinkers, Hart and Negri, with their concept of empire singular with a capital E. And on the other side, you've got David Harvey with new imperialism. Let's break these down because they seem to view the world very, very differently.
They do. It's a fundamental disagreement about where power lives today. Hart and Negri are looking at the modern world, the world of the internet, multinational corporations, global NGOs, and they say, look, there is no center anymore.
No Rome,
Yes.
no London, no Washington, D.C.
Exactly. They argue that power has become decentered. It's a network. They call it empire, but it's not an empire of one nation over another. It's a global system of capitalism that kind of floats above the nation state. Washington, D.C. doesn't control it. Beijing doesn't control it. It controls itself.
So in their view, if you're looking for the emperor, you're looking for a ghost. The throne is empty.
Right. It's a systemic power, not a national one. But David Harvey looks at that and says, I don't think so. He's not buying it.
No. Harvey points the finger squarely at the United States.
He does. He argues that we are seeing a new imperialism that is very distinctively American. And he breaks it down into two conflicting logics. This is a really crucial tool for understanding U.S. foreign policy over the last, say, 50 years. First, you have the territorial logic, or the political logic. This is how politicians and generals think. Borders, security, alliances. This is our land. It's about lines on a map.
Okay, that makes sense. The state's logic.
Then you have the capitalist logic, or the economic logic. This is how Wall Street thinks. Money flows wherever the profit is. It completely ignores borders. It wants open markets, free trade, not occupied territories.
And Harvey's point is that the U.S. is trying to do both at the same time.
And that they often crash right into each other. It creates these massive contradictions. The source uses the comparison of the Vietnam War versus the Iraq War, which is a fantastic way to see it. Think about Vietnam. From a territorial or political logic, the U.S. government justified it as stopping communism, the domino theory, we need to hold the line. But from a capitalist economic logic, it was an absolute disaster.
Right. It cost a fortune, it alienated partners, and there was no real market to be gained there at the time. It was a money pit.
Exactly. The economic logic would have said, stay home, this is bad business. But the political logic won out. Now look at the Iraq War. Harvey argues this was a fusion. You had the political goal asserting U.S. dominance in the Middle East, fighting terror, but you also have a very, very clear economic goal access to oil reserves, massive reconstruction contracts for American companies.
So Iraq was an attempt to make the war pay for itself, in a sense, to get the general and the banker to finally agree on something.
That's a perfect way to put it, to align those two logics. And Harvey argues that this new imperialism is basically the U.S. trying to use its military power to force open the world for its economic power.
Yeah.
But it's expensive, it's messy, and it creates massive resistance. It's not a stable system.
It sounds like a high-wire act. Okay, we spent a lot of time on imperialism, but we need to distinguish it from its partner in crime, colonialism. I feel like these two terms are so often treated as synonyms, but the text makes a really clear distinction. It's like the boardroom and the manager on the ground.
That's a good analogy. It's a really useful one.
Yeah.
Edward Said, who is a giant in this field, he argued that imperialism is the theory. It's the attitude. It's the grand idea. It's the decision made in London or Paris or Washington to dominate a distant place. It happens in the metropolis, the center.
So imperialism is the policy paper. It's the grand strategic vision.
Yes, and colonialism is the practice. It's the implementation. It's the boots on the ground. It's sending settlement to that distant territory. It's building the administrative apparatus, the tax collectors, the police, the schools, the laws. It's the nitty-gritty of control.
So you can have imperialism without colonialism.
Oh, absolutely. You can dominate a country economically or politically without literally moving your people there to run it day to day. But you can't have colonialism without imperialism. The settlement is always the result of the imperial attitude. One flows from the other.
Now, obviously, the era of formal colonies is mostly over. The flags came down in the 50s and 60s. But the source talks about neocolonialism. This feels like the loophole in the decolonization contract.
It's the invisible shackle. That's what it is. The argument here is that while the political armies and the governors left, the economic structures stayed right where they were. Imagine a country gains independence. Great, they have a flag, an anthem, a seat at the UN. But all their copper mines are still owned by a European company. Their entire banking system is controlled by foreign loans. Their currency is pegged to the dollar or the franc.
So they have political sovereignty on paper, but zero economic sovereignty in practice.
Exactly. And the source argues this is actually more insidious, more dangerous. Because if there are soldiers on your street, you know who the enemy is. You can see them. You can organize a resistance. But how do you fight a fluctuating exchange rate? How do you fight a structural adjustment program from the IMF? It's a form of control that is much harder to pin down and much, much harder to resist.
And this bleeds into the psychological aspect, too. We have to talk about post-colonialism, because this isn't just about money and trade. It's about the mind. It's about what happens inside people's heads.
This is where the damage runs the deepest. Post-colonialism looks at the identity crisis that follows an empire. If you are an Indian subject of the British Empire, you have been told for 2 centuries that your culture is backward, your religions or superstition, your language is secondary, and your history is irrelevant.
The source brings up Edward Said's Orientalism here, which feels like the foundational text for this whole idea.
It's a seminal work. It changed everything. Said argued that the West essentially hallucinated the East. They created a fantasy version of the Orient in their literature, their art, their politics. They painted the East as exotic, mysterious, beautiful, but also emotional and irrational and dangerous.
And in contrast, they painted themselves, the West, as rational, scientific, logical, and disciplined, the adult in the room.
Exactly. And here's the trick. If the East is irrational and childlike, then they need a parent. They need to be ruled for their own good. The stereotype becomes the justification for the conquest, but the real tragedy, according to post-colonial theory, is that the colonized people can start to believe it too. They internalize it. They start to see themselves through the eyes of the colonizer.
And that's the identity crisis. Trying to figure out who you are when the mirror you've been looking into for 200 years is a distorted one, a funhouse mirror. But I want to pause on the source's critique of post-colonialism itself. It's not afraid to turn the lens back on the academics. It accuses the theorists of having an ivory tower problem.
And it's a valid and very common critique.
Yeah.
You have these incredibly brilliant scholars like Spivak or Bhavha writing about the subaltern, which is their term for the poorest of the poor, the voiceless, the truly oppressed. But they are writing in language that is so dense, so academic, and so jargon-filled that the subaltern could never possibly read it or understand it.
So they are fighting for the oppressed in a language the oppressed can't even access. It's a bit of a paradox.
It is. It raises the question, is this theory really a tool for liberation, or is it just a career path for Western academics? It's a tension that the field hasn't really solved.
Okay, let's move down the timeline. The empires collapse, the colonies break free. But the West isn't done yet. We enter the era of development. The source is very specific to frame development not as, just progress, but as a specific historical project. This is the 1940s to the 1970s.
Context is everything here. We are in the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union are in this global ideological battle. And the U.S. is terrified that all these new, poor, post-colonial nations are going to turn communist. So development becomes the security strategy. The idea was We will loan you money. We will build you dams and roads. We will teach you how to be a modern capitalist state.
Be like us and you'll be safe from the red menace.
Be like us and you'll be rich. It was based on this profoundly elitist assumption that the Northern Western model of society was the only correct way to do things. One size fits all.
But then, especially in Latin America, people started looking around in the 60s and 70s and saying, hey, this isn't working. We're not getting richer. We're just getting more in debt.
Yeah.
And this is where we get dependency theory.
Yes, and Andre Gunder Frank is the key name here.
Yeah.
He completely flipped the script.
Yeah.
The standard story was, rich countries are developed, poor countries are undeveloped. It's just a matter of time. You're just a younger version of us, a child who will grow up.
Just keep working hard, follow our instructions, and you'll grow up to be America.
Frank said, no, that is a fundamental lie. He introduced the term underdevelopment. It's a different word with a totally different meaning. He argued that rich countries were undeveloped in the past, meaning they hadn't built factories yet, they were agrarian, but they were never underdeveloped. They were never actively exploited by a superior external power that was draining their resources and keeping them poor.
That is a crucial distinction. It's the difference between being a child who hasn't grown up yet and being a victim of theft who can't grow up because their resources are constantly being stolen.
Exactly. He argued that the poor nations aren't just behind, they are being actively held down. The entire global system is designed to extract value from the periphery, the poor nations, and funnel it to the core, the rich nations. So if you are in the periphery, you can't just develop by following the rules. The rules of the game are rigged against you.
And this leads directly to world systems theory, right? The idea that the poverty of the South isn't a separate problem from the wealth of the North. It's a condition for it.
Correct. You can't have the core without the periphery. Your cheap smartphone exists because of cheap labor and cheap resource extraction somewhere else. The system requires that inequality to function. One depends on the other.
Wow. That is a heavy realization. It changes how you look at foreign aid, global trade, everything completely. So we've looked at the political machinery, the economic machinery. Now I want to shift to the cultural battleground. This is where we get into the izations, Westernization versus Easternization. I think most people hear Westernization and just think globalization. They think it's the same thing.
And that's a mistake. The source is keen to correct. It argues that Westernization is just too broad. It's a clumsy term. It implies the West is this monolithic block, that it's all one thing. But look at the difference between the U.S. and Europe. The U.S. has the death penalty. Europe considers it a fundamental human rights violation. The U.S. has a very weak social safety net. Scandinavia has a very strong one. If you tell a developing nation to Westernize, which West are you talking about? The Texas West or the Swedish West? They're completely different models.
That's a great point. And it also ignores the fact that the East isn't just sitting there passively waiting to be Westernized. The source introduces the concept of Easternization. And this was one of the biggest surprises for me in the reading. Because when I hear Easternization, my mind immediately goes to, yoga. I think of Zen. I think of the Beatles going to India.
And those are all valid cultural imports for sure. But the source says, forget the incense for a minute. Look at the factory floor. The most profound impact of the East on the West in the late 20th century wasn't spiritual, it was industrial. We have to talk about Toyota.
Right, this is the just-in-time revolution.
It is hard to overstate how much this panicked Western industry. It was a genuine crisis. In the post-war era, American factories, European factories, they all ran on a model of just in case. You built massive warehouses, you stockpiled thousands of fenders, engines, screws, just in case something broke, just in case there was a strike, just in case demand spiked.
It feels safe, right? Having a big buffer. But it must be incredibly expensive.
Incredibly expensive. You have millions, sometimes billions of dollars of inventory just sitting there, gathering dust, doing nothing. It's dead capital. Then comes Toyota. They developed this radical new system just in time. The truck arrives with the steering wheels 20 minutes before they are scheduled to be bolted onto the cars. No warehouses, almost no safety net.
I can just imagine an American CEO in the 1970s looking at that and having a heart attack. It seems insane.
It induced sheer anxiety. Because think about the risk. If that one truck breaks down, the entire factory stops. The line goes dead. Western managers looked at this and said, this is suicide. It's fragile. But the Japanese philosophy was different. They argued that the vulnerability was the whole point.
How is vulnerability an asset? That sounds completely counterintuitive.
Because if the line stops, you have to fix the underlying problem immediately and perfectly. You can't just grab another part from the warehouse and hide the mistake. It forces the system to become perfect. It forces efficiency. It relentlessly exposes any weakness. And, well, it worked. Japanese cars were cheaper to make and they were better built. Western industry was getting crushed. So what did they do? They Easternized.
They had to copy it. There was no other choice.
They had to. Now, every major factory in the West uses some version of Japanese management techniques. You hear terms like quality circles, Kaizen, which means continuous improvement, just in time. These are all Eastern imports. So while we spend all this time worrying about Western culture taking over the East, the actual structure of how we work, the very rhythm of our modern economy, was fundamentally rewritten by the East.
That is a massive perspective shift. It's not just about what movies we watch or what music we listen to. It's about how we produce value itself. But speaking of movies, we have to confront the big one, the behemoth, Americanization. How is this different from Westernization?
It's more specific, and you could argue it's more aggressive. Americanization is the export of a specific lifestyle that is fundamentally based on mass consumption. And notice the shift the source describes. It's a crucial one. In the 1960s, the world, especially Europe, feared American production. They were scared of General Motors and U.S. Steel. They thought American factories would just outbuild everyone and take over.
But today, nobody is scared of American steel. That's not the threat.
No. Today, the world fears American consumption. The symbols of American power aren't factories anymore. They are franchises. It's McDonald's, it's Starbucks, it's Disney, it's Walmart. The fear isn't that America will make everything. It's that America will turn everything into a shopping mall.
We have to run through the ISizations here because the sociologist George Ritzer's concepts are just too good to skip. Let's start with McDonaldization. This isn't just about burgers, is it? It's a whole sociological framework.
It is. McDonaldization is the process by which the principles of the fast food restaurant are coming to dominate more and more sectors of American society, as well as the rest of the world. It values four main things: efficiency, calculability, predictability, and control. Think about it. When you walk into a McDonald's, whether it's in Paris or Peoria, you know exactly what the food will taste like. You know exactly how much it will cost. You know exactly how to order. There are no surprises.
It's comfortable, it's easy, but it's also dehumanizing in a way.
That's the core of the critique. It removes the human variable. It removes the surprise, the craft, the local flavor. It turns dining, which used to be a social, chaotic, cultural event, into a highly rationalized, efficient fueling process. And Ritzer argues we see this spreading everywhere. To healthcare, to education, to dating apps, we want everything to be as efficient and predictable as ordering a Big Mac.
Okay, then there is Disneyization.
This is the theming of reality. Disney parks are these perfectly sanitized, controlled environments where everything follows a narrative. There's no dirt, no spontaneity. Now look at our modern shopping malls, or even our gentrified city centers. They feel like movie sets, they are safe, they are clean, and they are kind of fake. We are scrubbing the grit out of reality to make it more pleasant and consumable.
And Coca colonization.
That's a classic term. It speaks to the power of branding to displace local culture. When a village in the Andes starts drinking Coke instead of the traditional local beverage that they've had for centuries, that's not just a change in diet. It's a shift in identity. You are, in a small way, joining the global consumer tribe. You're buying into an American brand.
But the source gets darker here. It's not just about consumer goods. It talks about the Americanization of the deep state, the legal system. I hadn't really thought about this, but the U.S. effectively exports its laws, doesn't it?
It does, and it is unique in how aggressively it does this. The U.S. has essentially internationalized its criminal justice system. Think about the war on drugs, or the war on terror, or anti-money laundering laws. The U.S. government goes to banks in Switzerland or Singapore and says, if you want to do business in dollars, which you have to follow our rules about who you do business with.
So the U.S. starts policing the world's financial system without actually occupying it.
Exactly. It's a form of sovereignty violation that has become normalized. If the U.S. wants a fugitive, they pressure the local government to arrest them and hand them over. They use extradition treaties and the threat of economic sanctions as a kind of global police baton. It's a globalization of a very specific American legal morality.
There is one concept in this section that really broke my brain a little. Americanization without America. The idea that you don't even need the U.S. anymore for this process to happen.
This is the Paulo Campero example from the text. I love this example because it's so perfect. So Paulo Campero is a fried chicken chain. It was founded in Guatemala. It is a Guatemalan company. But if you walk inside one, what do you see? Bright lights, fast service, branded uniforms, a standardized menu, drive-thrus.
It looks and feels like a KFC or a Popeyes. It follows the American fast food model.
It is a perfect clone of the American model. The Guatemalan founders looked at the U.S., they copied the software of how to run successful fast food giant, and they built it at home. And then, and this is the kicker, they became so successful that they exported back to the United States. There are Paulo Campero restaurants in Los Angeles and Dallas and Washington, D.C.
So the copy is sold back to the original. That's wild.
It proves that Americanization as a process has detached from America as a country. It's now just a global code, a code for how to run consumer capitalism. Anyone can write in that code now. You don't need to be an American to be an agent of Americanization.
That is a wild thought. It's like the virus has mutated and is now self-replicating, independent of the original host. Which brings us, inevitably, to the backlash, segment 5. Anti-Americanism. The source makes it very clear that this isn't just they hate us for our freedom, it's much, much more complex than that.
We have to categorize the hostility. It's not all the same thing. It comes from different places. First, you have psychological anti-Americanism. This is the knee-jerk stuff, the stereotypes. Americans are loud, fat, ignorant, and gun crazy. It's prejudice, plain and simple, not based on any deep analysis.
Okay, the simple stuff.
Then you have historical anti-Americanism. This is resentment based on facts, on things that actually happened. If you live in Iran, you remember this 1953 coup the CIA orchestrated. If you live in Chile, you remember Pinochet and the U.S. role there. This is anger at specific historical interventions.
Then there's the political and economic bucket.
Right. This is about current policy. We hate the conditions the IMF is putting on our country. We hate the invasion of Iraq. We hate that you refuse to sign major climate treaties. This is a rational critique of state action.
And finally, the cultural angle.
This is the fear of erasure. We don't want our children growing up wanting to be Americans. We want them to be French or Nigerian or Thai. It's a defense mechanism against that coca colonization we talked about, a fear of cultural homogenization.
And the source warns us not to dismiss all of this as just irrational hatred. Some of it is a very valid critique of policy and behavior. But this leads us to the final horizon, the era of the posts. The text suggests that the peak of American power, and maybe even Western power in general, is in the rearview mirror. We are entering a post-Western and a post-American world.
Let's look at the post-Western idea first, because it's a great illustration of the process. The best example the source gives is cricket.
The sport. How does cricket explain this?
The sport. Think about it. Cricket is the quintessential Victorian English game. It's slow, it's polite, it's obsessed with rules and etiquette. It was exported to the colonies, to India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, as a way to civilize them, to teach them English values and make them more English.
And
now, England is a second-tier player in its own game. The center of the cricket universe is India. The Indian Premier League is where all the money is, all the stars are. The Indian Board of Control effectively runs the global game. The styles of play, which are now more aggressive, more flashy, are dictated by the subcontinent. The colony took the cultural artifact, mastered it, monetized it, remade it in its own image, and now they own it. That is post-Westernization in a nutshell.
the student became the master, a perfect example. And that leads to Fareed Zakaria's thesis, which the book discusses, the post-American world. Now, does this mean the U.S. collapses? Do we see a fall of Rome scenario coming?
No, and that's a very, very important distinction he makes. Zakaria argues that the U.S. isn't necessarily declining in absolute terms. It still has the world's best military, the best universities, favorable demographics compared to Europe or China. It's not the fall of America. He is very clear on that. It is the rise of the rest.
So it's not that we're getting weaker, it's just that everyone else is getting stronger and catching up.
It's exactly. China, India, Brazil, a unified EU. They are growing faster. They're asserting their own interests on the world stage. So we are moving from a unipolar world where the U.S. could just point and say, do that, to a multipolar world with several centers of power.
It's like being the chairman of the board instead of the sole owner and king. You still have the most shares probably, but you have to negotiate. You have to build coalitions. You can't just dictate policy anymore.
And Zakaria argues this might actually be good for America in the long run. If you are the only superpower, every problem in the world is your problem. The buck always stops with you. If the world is multipolar, you can share the burden. And theoretically, if the U.S. is less overwhelmingly dominant, that intense anti-Americanism we talked about might fade. If you aren't the only giant in the room, people stop focusing all their anger on you.
That's a hopeful spin on it. A more balanced world might be a more stable one. So let's try to synthesize this massive stew we've been stirring for the last hour. We started with imperialism, raw political control. We moved to colonialism, the practice of settling and administration. We saw development, the Cold War economic strategy. Then the cultural waves of Westernization, Easternization, and the big one, Americanization. What is the big takeaway for you, for the listener?
For me, it's about visibility. Once you understand these concepts, you can't unsee them. It's like getting a new pair of glasses. You look at a news story about a trade war with China, and you don't just see tariffs. You see the deep historical clash of Westernization and Easternization.
Hmm.
You look at a protest in South America against the IMF, and you see the long legacy of neo-colonialism and dependency theory playing out in real time. You walk into a Starbucks in Tokyo and you see Americanization, but you also see the local post-Western adaptation of it.
It turns the noise of the daily news into a signal. It gives you the map to understand the territory.
It reveals the architecture of power. And that's what a deep dive should do, right? Show you how things are put together.
I want to leave the listener with one final, slightly provocative thought, building on what we've discussed. We talked about Paulo Campero. We talked about the code of consumer capitalism running without America needing to be there. If the American way of life, which at its core is really just rampant consumption, branding, efficiency, McDonaldization, if that system survives, even if the United States fades as a global superpower, if the whole world becomes a global shopping mall, regardless of what happens in Washington, D.C., have we really entered a post-American world? Or is it actually a world where America won so completely that the country itself isn't even necessary to the project anymore?
That is the haunting question, isn't it? Did the software finally eat the hardware?
Something to think about next time you order a latte. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.